When it's all said and done, it's how they remember you. That's what matters. Paul Felder versus Jim Miller for UFC 300 would be a fight between two guys that are going to be remembered differently. Paul Felder reached the top. He reached the plateau. He reached main event status. He lost tough fights in those split decisions. He had beaten some great fighters like Charles Oliveira to really plateau him up to where he got. Paul Felder's a smart man. He knew his body. He knew physically that after losing those tough fights that mentally he was done. And he's decided at 35 years old to call it quits. He decided to take the smart option. He had a skill with his mouth. He's a great speaker, and he knew that he had great relations with the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And his career was going to transform into color commentator. That's what he is now. He made the right move. He knew everything about his body and where he was going. He's a really smart fighter. So smart that he could watch other fights, talk about other people. And Paul Felder's a nice guy. That's why he had less of an ego and he was able to become a commentator. While Jim Miller kind of stayed out of it, just kept on fighting. Jim Miller never went out there and said that he wanted anything. Didn't want anything. He just wanted to fight. He fought some great fighters. His career is incredible. It's almost 16 years now that Jim Miller has been an Ultimate Fighting Championship. Nobody else has done what Jim has done. Jim has 43 fights in the UFC. He's built out of steel. This guy is incredible. At 40 years old, he's on a 2-fight winning streak, smashing Jesse Butler in 23 seconds, and in his last fight, doing what he does best, taking Gabriel Benitez down to the ground with the face crank and just destroying him down there. And afterwards, he calls out the Irish Dragon. He calls out Paul Felder. And I see a real big contrast between these two guys. Both guys are fighters. That's where they're similar. But where they're different is that Jim Miller never gave up. Miller continued to fight. Continued to fight throughout his entire career, while the Irish Dragon gave up. And I don't want to put down Paul Felder for that. I think it was a smart move that he made. But that's the real contrast here. Could Paul Felder come back? And he's the younger man. He's still 2 years younger than Jim Miller. Could he come back out of retirement in very short time and give Miller a shot? If these two guys fought earlier in their career, you'd have to go with Paul Felder. You'd have to say that Paul Felder would have won the fight. And it doesn't mean he would have won the fight. It's just that he would have been the favorite going into the fight. He's great standing up, while Jim Miller is great standing up too. He's got great power. But where they differ is that Jim Miller likes to take his opponents down to the ground and just crush them. Crush them, submit them. He's got 20 submissions in his career, and that's what he does best. Paul Felder on the floor might have a problem with Miller. If Jim Miller's on top, could be a short night for the Irish Dragon. I want to ask you, the fan, how you feel about this fight. Jim Miller never gave up. That's the difference here, while Paul, the Irish Dragon Felder, did. And I think that Miller might see some weakness in that, because at 35 years old, Jim Miller was not giving up. He had a tough time in his career. He fought some of the best in the world and almost lost his UFC career, but battled back through it, losing to Charles Oliveira, losing to Dan Hooker, being knocked out by Dan Hooker, and being submitted by Charles Oliveira. Fights that, at that point in time, Paul Felder found almost easy, or easier than Jim Miller did. So if you match these guys up now, after Paul Felder quit and left mixed martial arts, could Jim Miller attack that? Could he attack the weakness in Paul Felder? I think so. I think that once you quit, you're never the same. Momentum is a man's best friend. If you say goodbye to your momentum and you just relish in your past, you're going to be destroyed by the present. That's what Jim Miller is. Presently, he's just a madman who's just getting better and better. And I mean, he has so much experience and he's fought so many people that I think he would crush Paul Felder. And I think this is the perfect fight for Jim Miller, to really go and capitalize on that. To say, you just don't give up on this sport. You don't give up. You continue and you only get better. And if he could win a fight versus Paul Felder, he would prove that. He would prove that momentum has made him better, that he deserves more. I think that Jim Miller, when you look back on it all, it's about how they remember you. And it's about what you've done. And I think Jim Miller left one of the most incredible careers in the history of the sport. Although he never reached the top, never fought main events like Paul Felder, he just kept on crushing it. And he kept on continuing. And these other guys, whether they beat him or they lost, they were expelled from the Ultimate Fighting Championship, while Jim Miller just continued to fight, continued to get better. So I want to give it up to Jim and say that, Jim, life's hard. Life's hard for a lot of people, and we're not as strong as you. We give up, We give up. Sometimes it's just too much for us. And that's why we love you, because you never did. Thank you, Jim.